All right, new topic with the presidency. It says at the top, presidency is a negative power, and that negative power comes from the power to veto or the power to say no. So again, you remember the founding fathers, the intent was to give the new government the necessary power to rule so they wouldn't get into a situation that was similar with this new government, this new constitution that they had under the Articles of Confederation. They needed to give the Congress more power. So the way they could counterbalance that power was to give the presidency this power to veto legislation. So veto comes from a Latin word which means I forbid. It's just intended to be that check on presidential power, which I've already talked about. Now there also needs to be a check on the president's power to veto. And so the founding fathers created a situation whereby Congress could override the president's veto. That is done with a minimum 2/3 vote of both houses of Congress. It's got to be 2/3 or more in each house. Now, normally when the president vetoes a piece of legislation, he will send a veto message. Not always, but usually, particularly if it's an important piece of legislation. The idea behind that veto message is he is trying to influence the legislation the legislation or the proposed bill in the future. So if Congress were to reintroduce it, whether in that Congress or the next Congress, the president will state the reasons why he's vetoing it as to why he finds it objectionable, and so Congress will make attempts to try and remedy those things that the president finds offensive, so the next time they bring it to him, he won't veto it. The Congress also knows the Congress is deeply aware that the president has this power to veto legislation, and so because of that, they'll seek out the president's view on legislation, on these proposed laws, to make sure it doesn't suffer the fate of an executive veto. That's a big deal. The pocket veto. The pocket veto is an interesting dynamic that happens, can only happen once every 2 years. So what the Constitution says is, in order, once Congress places a bill on the president's desk, so to speak, once they give it to Congress, or give it to the president has 10 days to decide whether or not to sign it, or to veto it, or to do nothing. If the president does nothing, after 10 days it becomes law without his signature. What if, so this pocket veto is the idea that a president can veto legislation if it's at the end of a congressional term. So if Congress's term ends at the end of December and they give him a piece of legislation on Christmas Eve, December 24th, there's not 10 days left before the end of the congressional term. If the president does nothing, the bill doesn't become law because it hasn't gone through that 10-day waiting period. There is a distinct advantage with a pocket veto. By pocket vetoing a piece of legislation, by doing nothing, putting it in his back pocket, so to speak, and leaving it there, that's where the expression comes from, Congress never has a chance to override the president's veto. That is the advantage of the pocket veto. But again, it's really only possible to do this at the end of a congressional term when there's 10 days or fewer left. Now, in 1996, Republicans took over House of Representatives for the first time in 40 years. One of the ways they did it, they made this contract with America, and they said, if we are elected, there's a number of things that we will do to fix what they saw as problems in the United States. One of the things that they want to do was to pass the line item veto. The line item veto is a power that most state governors have, which allows them to line out just a single line or a few lines or a bunch of lines in a bill without having to reject the entire bill. So a lot of people thought this was a good idea, to give the president this power of line item veto, to line out specific portions of the bill. For instance, as you remember from our lectures on Congress, one of the things that happens when they're trying to get an important piece of legislation through Congress is they'll add these amendments or these riders to a bill which will bring funding or funds back to a district to try and get a member of Congress to sign the piece of legislation. And so with the line item veto, the president could go through there and knock all those things out of the bill. That was the intent of the Republicans when they did this. But the Supreme Court declared or ruled that the line item veto was unconstitutional. And at first I thought this was a terrible idea because it certainly would have done wonders in trying to balance the budget. But the reason they gave is equally a force. So we're kind of caught in this dilemma. They reasoned that it gave too much power to the president and made him a super legislator, which really is a violation of the separation of powers. There is an executive branch who enforces the law, and there is the legislative branch who makes the law. But if you give the president the power to just go through with his pen and just line up things and just he can craft a bill to his own making, and everything else just goes away. So that is why the Supreme Court declared it unconstitutional, because it really made the president a super legislator. All right. Next slide here. Grab the wrong mouse. Here we go. Originally, clear back to George Washington, John Adams, the first presidents, they only used vetoes when they felt a bill violated the Constitution. They thought that this was not what the Constitution allowed or intended, and so they'd veto legislation kind of as in a sense like they were a court. Said, no, the Constitution doesn't allow this, and they'd veto it. Andrew Jackson broke new presidential ground for using the veto by rejecting bills that he disagreed with on policy grounds. And he vetoed more legislation than all prior presidents combined. So I realize this chart is small, but if you look at this, what you see is Washington had 2 regular vetoes and no pocket vetoes. Madison had 5 regular vetoes, 2 pocket vetoes, and for a total of 7. And then Monroe had 1 veto. And then Jackson vetoed 5 pieces of legislation on policy preference and 7 pocket vetoes. So he vetoed a total of 12 pieces of legislation. All previous presidents before him had only vetoed a total of 10 pieces of legislation. So after that, you can see the steady increase here till we get to the modern era. Presidents really began to look at pieces of legislation and did they agree with it on policy grounds. And if they didn't, they would veto it. And certainly that is within the prerogative that the Constitution is allowed to them. You come down clear to FDR. You see that he vetoed 372 pieces of legislation, pocket vetoed 263 for a total of 635 pieces of legislation. This is interesting because when he was president, Congress controlled both houses, Democrats controlled both houses of Congress. So it goes to show you, just because political parties are the same, it doesn't mean that the executive and the Congress will see eye to eye. And this is exactly what the Founding Fathers hoped, that the jealousies that the checks and balances created would create a check. The executive would check the Congress, and Congress would check the executive. You can see here where these vetoes are overridden. So in all those pieces of legislation, only 9 were overridden by this democratically controlled Congress. So you see here that this veto power is real, that it is it gives the president enormous power if he's willing to use it, if he's willing to make the veto. All right, moving on to a new topic, divided government. Divided government is when one party controls the presidency and the other party controls one or both houses of Congress. So right now with Trump, we have Trump being a Republican and the Senate being controlled by Republicans, but the House of Representatives is controlled by the Democrats. So that is the definition of divided government. Now it could be that both houses are controlled by Democrats, and if you had a Republican president, you'd have divided government. There's a lot of people out there who believe that divided government produces a kind of gridlock, where the government is incapable of moving, because as you've seen this fighting with the Democrats and the Republicans over Trump's impeachment and just about on every other issue, there's just this animosity that's created. That certainly is the case on some issues, but it is not the case on the most important issues. The most important issues, one found one political study found that even in those most important cases, Congress is able to produce important legislation when there is divided government. For instance, the Marshall Plan was the plan to rebuild war-torn Europe after World War II. That was passed by divided government. You see, just recently, the piece of legislation passed by Congress, by a democratically controlled House of Representatives and a Republican-controlled Senate, that is aimed at alleviating the effects that the coronavirus is having on the economy. Important piece of legislation that flew through Congress despite the fact that it was divided. All right, that is it for this lecture. We'll pick up with the next lecture dealing with war and the presidency.